I'm going to tell you today about Connectionist account of analogy making. Actually, I wouldn't call it really a model because it's not coherent enough to be a model. It's just an approach to studying and explaining analogy making, which is based on connectionist modeling. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. Well, first of all, I'll try to justify the development of a connectionist account of analogy making. So why should we make it in a connectionist way? So what is the advantage? What do we benefit from this? Then I'll make a short overview of existing connectionist approaches to analogy making. And I'll outline where they fall short and what the problems are, and what are in general the problems for connectionist modeling of a process like analogy making. And I will focus more on one particular problem, and the problem is how relations are represented. So it turns out that the major problem in modeling analogy making in connectionist terms is about representing structure. In particular, representing structure as numeric vectors with fixed dimensionality. And I'll go over a few approaches, and then I'll discuss the approach I introduced, which is called the vector approach to representing symbols, or just VARS. And I will explain VARS and how it can be used. And then I'll show you how a VARS representations, so a relational structures, encoded as numeric vectors, can be used for making an analogical mapping. So the analogical mapping will be described as a series of vector operations. Then I'll give you some examples, and then we'll have a discussion, tell you what are the major advantages of this approach, of course, what are the problems that I have not addressed yet when I'm going next in my research, and I'll be very happy to answer questions and to have a discussion on this topic. So why connectionists? That's a bit of a philosophical question, at least to me. Now, first of all, connectionist models, I presume that you all aware what connectionism is, and you know the history of connection, its recent grand success in the field of artificial intelligence and so forth. But its major advantage is that it's supposed to be more cognitively and neurologically plausible. So if you describe a cognitive process using a connectionist modeling, then presumably that explanation, that account will be more cognitively and neurologically plausible. Because connectionism sets a lot of constraints on your modeling work. So it limits the way you think about cognition. Some things are just not allowed in connectionist modeling. You can't think of, for example, some neat algorithm with distinct computational steps executed in serial order. That's just not possible. You can't also think of high-level data structures or things like that. So you are forced to think of cognition in much fine-grained terms. And this is a major advantage of connectionism. There is also a pragmatic aspect of doing connectionist modeling. It's basically the only modeling paradigm which is known to almost everyone in the field of the cognitive sciences. So you can hardly find a cognitive scientist who is not aware of the basic terms of connectionism. So if you build your model in connectionist terms, then almost everyone will understand it. It's a good formalism, in other words, rather than creating your own modeling architecture and introducing your own concepts, your own inventory of terms and concepts and methods and so forth. That may take a lot of effort to understand. So using the language of connectionism is a good thing by itself, just for pragmatic reasons. And my personal point about connectionism is that what I like about it is that it's a minimalist account of cognition. I mean, there are not that many assumptions in connectionism. There are a few assumptions, such as you have a massive repairable computation that knowledge is distributed across a fixed number of units, and that learning takes place by small adjustments in connection weights. But there are not so many principles of connectionism. So if you manage to describe a cognitive process in connectionist terms, that will be a very concise description, very minimalist description. And given that I think that we still know relatively few about cognition, it makes sense to start with such minimalist accounts. If you can find a connectionist explanation of a given phenomena, it will be a better account than another one which makes much more assumptions and which presumes the existence of all kinds of sophisticated mechanisms and data structures and neural architectures and so forth. I think at the moment of development in the cognitive sciences, at the current moment, the most compelling informative models are the simple ones. Of course, you might disagree with me. I'll be glad to discuss this with you, but this is my starting position. That's my view. And this is one of the reasons I have switched to connectionist modeling. I used to do other kind of modeling in the past, but have entirely switched to connectionism nowadays. Now, here's an analogy. Sorry about the pointer. I have to. Okay, see, here's an analogy about the alternative to connection. I guess you all know that the classical alternative to connectionist modeling is symbolic modeling, so using symbols. Now, in this analogy, the relation of symbols to cognitive science is the same as the relation of ether to physics. I mean, there are phenomena in cognitive science that can be easily, neatly accounted for using symbols. For example, language or relational reasoning, analogy making. And the same was for physics, like in the late 19th century. People introduced the concept of ether just to explain about the phenomena, and that was a very nice explanation, a very intuitive one, and a wrong one. So it turned out that you don't need ether to explain this phenomena. For example, to explain light or magnetic waves or anything like that. So people have argued that the same holds for symbols in the cognitive science. I mean, it's true that you can explain many phenomena using symbols, but you don't really need them. I mean, if you get rid of symbols, it might get a little bit more difficult to explain this phenomena, but you'll be closer to the truth. And there's another quote from one of the big names in connectionist modeling. So all we have in our heads is a big activity vectors that cause more activity vectors. So all we have is some numeric vectors that transform into other numeric vectors. Of course, this is a mathematical approximation of what's going on, but yes, that's all that matters. So we shouldn't use more complex descriptions of what's going on in the mind than numeric vectors. And that's Jeffrey Hinton. I guess you all heard about him. He is one of the creators of modern connectionism in the 80s, and also currently a big name in artificial intelligence. So he's a little bit extreme. Now, what I'm going to present today is not that extreme, but it's good to know this position. So there have been a number of approaches to analogy making using connectionist modeling. They started in the 80s, and work is still being done even today. So, for example, I'll mention just 7 of these models, but actually there are more than this. The analogical constraint mapping engine by Howard and Taggart was one of the first connectionist model of analogy making. It basically assumes that we can organize concepts, including relations, in some kind of constraint situation network, and let this activation spread in this network, and it will settle in a given state, which is the one that we are looking for. For example, we can use this final state to infer what is mapped to what, and so forth. A far more sophisticated model was proposed by Halford, the structured tensor analogical reasoning, known as STAR usually. So Halford's model, I spend more time talking about it because it's based on a very important idea, the idea of tensor products put forward by Smolensky, which is a way to represent relations with varying complexity using numeric vectors. Perhaps one of the most famous, most influential models of analogy making is the Lisa model by Hummel and Hoek, published in Psych Review, which also makes important stipulations about how relations are represented. I'll also talk more about it. So the major assumption in this model is that our relations are represented in time. So for example, figures are bound to roles using synchrony, using temporal binding. So actually the representations unfold in time. This is a connectionist model, but it's not the typical connectionist model. Actually, they call it a hybrid symbolic connectionist model. As long as Hummel, I don't know about Hoek, but John Hummel still thinks, he still believes that you need some kind of symbolic representations. You need them in order to account for analogy making. So the only questions to him is how exactly you implement the symbols in connectionist terms. Another project which is not very famous is actually a dissertation by Douglas Blank, which is a mainstream connectionism enterprise, in which he trains neural networks to, as he puts it, to learn to make analogies by analogy. It's a very interesting work. Fortunately, I don't know whether it's published officially or not, but the dissertation is available online. It's really interesting work. It's kind of limited because he only selected a certain kind of analogies, and this approach is obviously actually applicable just to a certain kind of analogy tasks, so it's not that general. There's also the work by my PhD advisor, Boycho Kokinov, and one of his students, Alex Petrov, about associative memory-based reasoning. That's a model which is kind of similar to Lisa, and which is also hybrid. I mean, it has a connectionist part, spreading of activation, constraint satisfaction, but there's also a symbolic part which uses the connectionist one, which is based on the connectionist one. So again, here the idea is that you can have connectionism to implement certain aspects of analogy making, but you need symbols for some particular aspects of analogy making. There's also the work by the Burbeck team, analogies relational priming, which is a very exciting and extraordinary idea, which tries to reframe what we mean by analogy. And in this view, analogy is actually not a complicated symbolic process, but something much more primitive, which they call the relational priming. So it's analogy making boils down to how one set of relations activates another pair, another relational pair. And it's a pure connectionist work again. It's quite convincing as a work, but again, it has a problem with scaling up. I mean, it's not really clear how the same approach can be applied to other analogical tasks. They only use it for analogical completion, and it seems to work fine. They gave a very nice developmental count. It's not really clear how you can actually scale this up. How can you account for more complex forms of analogy making in this way. And there's some work going on in the last few years. It's actually led by people working for DeepMind, that's Google-owned company, artificial intelligence company. Turns out they're also interested in analogy. They start their papers with the classical claim, analogy is the core of cognition, which I think dates back somewhat to the 80s. So their approach is purely computational, not really psychologically informed, although they do make psychological speculations. Basically, they feed a lot of data into a deep learning model, and they get some reasonable performance on particular tasks. So this first paper by Barrett, they actually use Raven matrices and show that the model can achieve some success in solving Raven matrices, which perhaps you know is a classical analogical tasks. But again, this solution is tailored for a particular task. And one can even ask whether this has anything to do with analogy making at all, or just these powerful models are learning to approximate human performance in a particular task. So to sum up, the state of connectionist modeling of analogy making, earlier models relied mainly on constraint satisfaction, and that was good because it was a good way to account for mapping, for example, such as the Ackermann model by Hovek and the model by Boycho, Amber. But the problem with this model was that they had no learning. I mean, they started with a network and then they ran constraint satisfaction on this network. But the question is, where does this network come from? I mean, they couldn't account how to actually build these connections between entities. So other models are far more sophisticated, such as Lisa by Hummel and Horek. They can account for full-blown analogy making for many tasks and many processes, but they require some specialized neural machinery. So there's still connectionist models as long as this machinery is implemented in connectionist terms. But this is some very specialized machinery. This is known as the structured connectionism. So this is an approach in connectionism in which you build a particular neural architecture for a very particular purpose. While the mainstream connectionism, what's appealing about it, that you use the same tools for all kinds of tasks and it seems to work. The problem with these models is that they make very strong claims first, so they don't subscribe to this minimalist view that I support. So they make strong claims because these models are not really simple, they're quite complicated. And it's really hard to integrate them into the rest of connectionism. So if, for example, you take Lisa and you want to connect it to some other existing connectionist models, for example, some object recognition models or some other models for processing language, and we know that nowadays we have various models which are really successful in these domains, it's not possible to put them together. I mean, they are models on their own, and it doesn't let you actually benefit from the recent advances in artificial intelligence and in modeling in general, in neural network modeling. So you can't actually make use of this representation learning, such as embeddings, or you can't benefit from the breakthroughs in natural language processing or in modeling the visual system and so forth. Some of the other models I mentioned, I already said this actually, they work well, but just for a single, usually simple task. So they're not really accounts of analogy making in general, but they're modeling a particular analogical task, which is not bad, of course. That makes sense. But what we're looking for today is a more general solution, more universal solution to explaining analogy making. Of course, it may turn out in the end that there's nothing such as analogical analogy making. So this is actually an umbrella term. It covers a series of actually quite different tasks. That might be actually the situation, but there is reasons to believe that there is such a mechanism, a universal mechanism of analogy making, a universal cognitive function, and perhaps we can model it. The deep learning models, they as always is with deep learning, they're spectacular. The results are, I mean, approaching human performance. They will be really exciting. But if you look closer at these models, you'll see that they have little to do about analogy making. They may be they can actually successful in modeling certain tasks. For example, I'm pretty sure that it don't take much time for computers to become better than humans in solving relevant matrices, for example. Because there are actually other papers than the one that I cited, newer papers, and they're getting better and better and better, and we know where this goes to. Maybe in a couple of years, computers will reach human performance and go by it. But as cognitive models, they're not really good. I mean, they really don't tell us much about analogy making. The goal of cognitive modeling is not just to account for certain performance, but to explain. And these models don't really explain anything. So, for example, these deep learning models that they have no mapping. So there's no mapping in them, no analogical mapping. No way to do inference, to do transfer. No way to enrich one of the domain based on the other domain. They just solve a very particular task. So the output of the model is just the answer. So just like if you're given a relevant matrix, and you just have to pinpoint the right answer, and that's it. And what exactly happened and how it happened, we don't know. Even if they're actually accounting for analogy making, correct? I mean, even if the way they work is similar to the way biological cognition works, it's still not a good explanation because it doesn't really tell us how it works. These models are so complex, so deep, that we can't understand how exactly they work. It's just mystery. So from a cognitive modeling point of view, they're not very, well, they're actually not informative at all. And the fact that they will be able to solve a particular task, such as relevant matrices, doesn't entail they will be able to solve other analogical tasks. Actually, progress on modeling one of the tasks kind of doesn't actually inform us anything about performance on another task. So what are the main problems with connectionist modeling? So as you see, there are many models, but none of them is perfect. They all have their particular problems. And I only briefly mentioned these problems. Actually, there are more deep fundamental problems with all of the models. So coming up with a connectionist model of analogy making is very hard, actually. It's a very hard task. Well, analogy making was actually given as one of the cognitive functions that cannot be accounted for in connectionist terms. In the 80s, when they have this big discussion about connectionism and symbolic modeling, the opponents of connectionism often gave analogy making as one of these functions that cannot be accounted in connectionist terms. So there's some fundamental problems. It's not just about finding the right model, the right setup. There are fundamental problems. So here are some of the fundamental problems. The most fundamental of the fundamental problems is how do we represent structure? This is a very difficult problem, actually, because connectionism is inherently incapable, some people would say. I would say it's inherently difficult to represent structure. And if you dig deeper into this problem, you'll see that the heart of the problem is the binding problem. So how do you temporarily bind together pieces of information? So this binding problem is fundamental to understanding cognition, and in particular to understanding relational reasoning and to represent understanding analogy making. So we'll spend quite a lot of time today talking about the binding problem and how it can be addressed. But apart from the binding problem, there are other problems. For example, how do you learn relational concepts? And even if you have learned them, how do you recognize novel instances of known relations? I won't talk much about this today, but I think this is another important problem because some of the best performing, the most complete models of analogy making nowadays, they lack this capacity to learn new relations. And even if they have the capacity to learn relations, they don't have the capacity to utilize these relations. I mean, to recognize novel instances of the relation. So this is an area in modeling relations which is kind of not addressed enough. There's also the problem with analogical mapping. Why is this a problem? Because analogical mapping is a computationally very demanding process. So you can't really model analogical mapping with a feed-forward network, for example. It's something that takes time, unfolding times, and we know this from experiments. You know that every time you give such a task to a participant, you just look at their face and you can see how they struggle with it. So that's something about some process that unfolds in time, that's computational heavy, that requires short-term memory, integration of information in short-term memory. So it's kind of a complicated process. And this is why, like the deep learning approaches, which is just feed-forward networks, they cannot account for analogical mapping. So the first connectionist account of analogical mapping with the constraint satisfaction models, in which analogical mapping again happens by settling a neural network to a particular state, and that makes sense because it's again a complex process unfolding in time, a computationally heavy process, but it has its downsides as well. So accounting for analogical mapping in particular is difficult, and it's not quite well understood still. In connectionist terms, of course, we can quite well account for analogical mapping if you use symbolic modeling, for example. And last but not least, a full, like a complete model of analogy making actually requires integrating several distinct functions, such as the retrieval, mapping, transfer, inference. It's perhaps not possible to have a single connectionist model of all these processes. We'll have to have several different models and put them together. And that's again a difficult task for connectionist modeling. So today I will focus mainly on the first problem because I think it's the most important one, representing structure. It's also the most studied one, as long as there are many attempts to solve it. But I'll be glad to discuss the other problems as well.
Ivan,
So
can
what's
I
the binding problem?
ask
Yes.
a question? Someone's asked if you could clarify the computational definition of learning.
A computational definition of learning. This is acquiring some abilities. So, for example, computational definition of learning in connectionism is adjusting the connection weights. So adjusting the strength of the connections between units. That's how connectionism views learning. Of course, there are other kinds of learning which cannot be implemented in connectionist terms, or at least not in a straightforward way. But to put it simply, acquiring new information, like new knowledge. And in connectionist modeling, that's happens only by changing the connection weights. At least in mainstream connection. Of course, connection is a huge field, so there are many subfields in it. There is a connectionism which doesn't use learning at all. For example, like echo-state networks, reservoir computing in which they claim that you don't actually need learning at all, or if you need, it's just a bit of learning just for classification, for example, but the majority of the weights never actually change. Well, that's more like an exotic idea. Mainstream connectionism is about learning by changing the connection weight in a gradual way. I hope I answered the question.
Cheers. Thanks. Yeah, that was great.
So the binding problem, as I said, is one of the most fundamental problems in cognitive science in general. It's an old problem. So to put it simply, the binding problem is about how do we group together pieces of information that represent the same thing. For example, let's say we have 4 features activated in a given moment. 2 features encoding colors, red and green, and 2 features encoding shapes, a square and circle. We have to bind the red feature on the left. In the left part of the screen, we bind the red feature to the square feature and the green feature to the circles feature. And we end up with a representation which is different from what we have on the right, in which we have the same features, but they are bound in a different way. So our cognitive system should be able to distinguish these 2 situations, and that's obvious for vision. I mean, if our visual system was unable to do this, we won't have vision at all. We only have like chaos. So how does the visual system solve this problem? And I'll argue actually it's a more fundamental problem. It's not just about the visual system. It's a general problem. How do we bind together pieces of information that represent the same thing? Now, for the visual system, actually, there is a relatively simple solution. It's known as the feature integration theory, and it says that features are bound by location, because representation in the visual cortex, regional topic, then features that are activated in the same location in the cortex usually belong to the same object. For example, here on the left, the feature red is activated at the same location as the feature square. So this is how red is bound to square. And the same for the other object. On the right, the feature green is at the same location as the feature square. So green is bound to square. And indeed, there is evidence that this is how the visual system works. But there are a couple of questions. So the first question is, how do we use this knowledge? And the usual answer is, well, somewhere in the brain are neurons, which are called conjunctive neurons or conjunctive codes, which encode for the simultaneous activation of square and red on the same location. And this is actually the unit coding for red square. So basically, our visual system has this conjunctive code that encodes for a particular constellation of features. And if you activate one of these conjunctive codes, then you know what exactly is present, or red square or green square, for example. But the other fields of domains of cognition in which it's just not computationally feasible, it's not even possible to have representations of all possible combinations. For example, in language. So we have words, and we can combine words to produce meaning, for example, by making sentences. But the trick here is that perhaps none of the sentences I have said in the last half an hour is something that you have heard exactly like this in your experience. So you actually presented with words which are organized in some novel way. You know the words, but the way they're organized, the way they're structured is novel to you. And still you understand. So somehow words are bound together in some particular way. They're bound by syntax, of course, so that you can understand it. You cannot rely on pre-existing knowledge. You can't rely on, for example, like here, having particular representation of a red square. For example, I can say something like pumpkin square. You never heard this, but still you can remember it, you can process it, you can use it in sentences. So you can bind together these two words. So this is kind of obvious to us, but if you think about it from the modeling point of view, it's a difficult problem. And this problem has several aspects. So, for example, one of the aspects, it's known as the problem of two. So let's say that I represent features as numeric vectors, as they are represented in connectionism, of course. So I have a numeric vector, for example, which represents a cat. Now let me see where my pointer is. Can you see my pointer? Can you see my pointer? Sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, here it is. It disappeared again. Anyways, so it's just too slow. Okay. So we have a vector like this one, which represents a cat. It's a localist representation of a cat. This is the kind of representation you can have a connectionist model. So what happens if you have two cats? So if you just superimpose this, given that it's a binary representation, so the maximum is 1 of each unit, the maximum activation of each unit is 1. If you just superimpose them, you end up with something which is just the representation of a cat. So how do I know that I have two distinct instances of the same thing? If you use connectionist symbolic modeling, that's easy. For example, I have a particular symbol and just make two copies of this symbol. Cat1, cat2. But what about connectionism? Can I copy the vector? And how? I mean, in connectionism, things are represented in the same medium. I mean, you have, for example, the hidden layer of a network, and all representations are there. So you don't have the luxury of creating new data structures, like new representation of media. You have to use what you have. So how exactly do I represent two instances of the same thing, or three instances? And that's important because obviously, perhaps any kind of biological organism can do this. But for connectionism, this simple problem is actually a difficult problem. There's a lot of literature on whether you can account for numerosity in connectionist terms. It's problematic, but even this much simple problem, distinguishing two cats from one cat, is still a problem. And it's about binding. So why? Because I have to bind the representation of one cat in one place and the representations of the other cat in another place or in another time if we use temporal binding. But in the end, I should be able to distinguish them, set them apart. So I have to be able to distinguish one cat from two cats. And if I have two cats, I will be able to distinguish each particular cat from the other one. Well, the other manifestation of the binding problem is the so-called verbal binding problem, which is a more typical problem. So how do I distinguish a cat sitting on a dog from a dog sitting on a cat? So this is similar to the binding problem I started with in the visual domain. So I have the same features, the features of a dog, the features of a cat, the features of sitting, whatever they are, that's a mystery. But let's say I have some features sitting. If I just activate them all of them at the same time, I wouldn't be able to distinguish the two situations. For example, if I just superimpose these three vectors representing a dog, a cat, and sit on, I'll end up with an ambiguous pattern of activation, which encodes a dog, a cat, and sitting, but it doesn't actually let me determine who is sitting on who. And as you might guess, for relational reasoning, that's fundamental. I mean, you can't model relational reasoning without solving this problem. So if you want to do connectionist modeling of relational reasoning, and particular analogy making, you have somehow to solve this problem, the variable binding problem. And actually, much of the literature on connectionist modeling of analogy making is about solving this particular problem. As a matter of fact, the solution to this problem is important not just for analogical reasoning. That's a problem that has been discussed in many other fields in cognitive science. It's also discussed in vision because the feature integration doesn't work for all kinds of visual tasks. It doesn't work, for example, for visual working memory. It's also heavily discussed in literature on language because you need this. We need to solve the variable binding problem in order to account for language. So what are perhaps the most famous solution, the most widely adopted one, is the so-called tensor products. The tensor products were introduced by Paul Smolensky in the late 80s, beginning of 90s. And Smolensky, he's a linguist, so he actually introduced them for the sake of modeling language, but they're now used for modeling all kinds of tasks, all kinds of domains of cognition. So it's a very simple idea. It's if you start with two vectors representing two things that you want to buy together. For example, you want to buy the particular role to a particular filler. In this case, the role will be somebody who is sitting on, so this is the subject, and the filler will be, in the top image will be the cat, and the bottom image will be the dog. So if you want to bind the subject of sitting to the dog, so you have a pattern for the role. That's the representation of the subject of sitting. And you have a pattern for the filler, the dog. This is the resulting representation of dog being bound to the role of the subject in the sitting relation. So basically, it's something like a vector multiplication. And this is what's called a vector product. It's called a tensor product. I never really understood why they call it a tensor, because actually tensors are used in a little bit different context in physics, but it sounds fancy, it sounds good, and it's well established, so it's a tensor product. Or just a vector product. And so you start with two vectors of the same dimensionality, two one-dimensional vectors of size 4, and you compute the tensor product, which is a two-dimensional matrix of size 4. So it's 4x4 matrix. And of course, you can do more bindings. If you have high order relations, then you can actually you can bind the dog, which is the subject of sitting. You can actually, for example, bind it to the second argument, to the second role of the relation of possession. For example, I have a dog and my dog is sitting on the cat. I can represent this, but it will result in a three-dimensional vector. And if I need even more higher dimensional representations, I will end up with 4-dimensional, 5-dimensional, and so forth. So that's the inherent problem with this approach, is that the more things you bind, if you have high order representations, the more dimensions you need. And this is a solution which, from a computer science point of view, is terrible. I mean, that's called dimensionality explosion. You start with one dimension, you may end up with like 10 dimensions. 10-dimensional vectors, 10-dimensional representations are really hard to process. But people have argued that that's not such a big problem, actually, because we humans are also limited in this aspect. So, so it has been speculated that the maximal dimensionality can represent, the maximal dimensionality of these tensor products is corresponding to the working memory capacity. So just like our working memory capacity is limited, it's quite limited, So this is the same constraint that also holds for the maximum dimensionality of tensor products. So Graham Halford, which perhaps you know is one of the great theoreticians of working memory, he built a whole theory about this. He really liked tensor products and built a whole theory about it. And the star model I mentioned a few slides ago is based on this assumption that yes, representations are bound by using tensor products in the brain, and the resulting limit on the ability to bind, which results from the maximal dimensionality of the tensor products, corresponds functionally to what we observe in working memory tasks, to the limit on working memory in working memory tasks, which sounds good. If you're interested in this idea, you can explore the paper by Graham Halford. So, by the way, other researchers, such as Canerva and Plate, turned out not to be so satisfied with this explanation of the dimensionality explosion, and they came up with something which is very similar to tensor products, but which ends up with vectors which have the same dimensionality as the initial vectors. So there is no dimensionality explosions. These are the so-called holographically reduced representation. That's a clever algorithm suggested by Canerva, which basically is the same operation, but it results in a vector which has the same dimensionality as the row and the fewer. So you don't increase dimensionality, which from the point of view of Halford, for example, is not good because you're losing all this point about the cause of the constraints on working memory and so forth, all this psychological stuff. But from a computational point of view, it's much better. Of course, there is a cost of replacing tensor products with holographic reduced representation. I think it's perfect. So holographic reduced representations are noisy. So you actually, when you do this binding, you're losing some of the information. But they have shown that under certain conditions, this is acceptable. So there's a lot of work on approximating tensor product operations by using vectors with fixed dimensionality. And there are other solutions of the same problem, with not exactly the holographic representation, but some others. Doesn't matter. However, this approach has a more fundamental, more serious problem. So it's not just about the dimensions. Okay, we can live with this. Something more profound is going on here. It has been very nicely pointed out by John Homo in a paper in 2011. To put it shortly, the problem is that the representations which result, the tensor product representations, when you bind representations using tensor products, the representations you end up with have some undesirable properties. So what you see here on the left, on the x-axis, you have the fewest. So what we have done here, what John Homo has done, he has computed the cosine similarity of the representations of two relations. And what has been varied is the degree to which the fewers in the two relations are similar and the degree to which the roles are similar. So you can think of it like structural versus superficial similarity. And it turns out that the resulting tensor products are only similar to each other if both the fewers and the relational roles map, if they're similar as well. So in other words, the similarity of the resulting tensor product is an interaction of the fewer similarity and the role similarity. For example, consider this case. This case here, let me point it. This case. So here the role similarity is the maximum one. So the cosine similarity between the roles is 1. So these are structurally very similar. But the fewer similarity is really low. So the fewers are very different. This is the situation just like, for example, the computer is to the left of the TV set, and Biden is to the left of Trump. The same relation, let's assume it's the same relation, but the viewers are completely different. Yet people see some similarity between these two cases because of the structural similarity. So the roles are similar, although the objects might be very different. But the resulting tensor products, so if you bind the viewers to the corresponding roles of the left of relation using tensor product, the resulting tensor products representations will be completely different. So if you just compare these tensor product representations, these vector tensor product representations, they will not be the same at all. And this is not something we want from such kind of representations. We would like to have vector representations, so that, in other words, by the way, when I say vector, you can replace it with connectionist representations, because connectionist representations are vector representations. So we would like to have connectionist representations which preserve both the structure, the role similarity, and the superficial viewer similarity. It should be function of both, and they should not interact. They should just be added to each other. So the more similar the viewers are, the more similar the resulting representations are. The more similar the roles are regarding the viewers, the more similar the resulting representation should be. But this requirement is not met by tensor products. And it's also not met by holographically reduced presentation, as you can see on the right. So functionally, there's no difference between tensor products and the approximations using holographically reduced presentations and others. And that's a fundamental problem. So that's, according to Hummel, the main problem with tensor products, that you end up with representations which do not preserve this similarity, do not construct the right similarity space. So if you represent things in this way, then you may end up with patterns which encode similar things, but the patterns themselves will be very different from each other. So there is no correspondence between the similarity of the connectionist patterns and the similarity of the things they encode, they represent. And that's really the problem. So the only way to compute the similarity, if you have tensor products, that's the only way to compute the real structural and superficial similarity, I would say the real analogical similarity, is by decomposing the tensor products into their constituents, which totally misses the point. I mean, the idea was to be able to bind together information and work with it, rather than having to decompose it, to unbind it anytime we want to do something with it. Because if this was the case, we won't bind it at all. So what's the point of tensor products then? Now, a different solution was given by John Hummel, the critics of tensor products. Of course, he criticizes tensor products and proposes a solution, a different solution which works. That's based on the idea of temporal binding. That's another popular idea, not just in relational reasoning, but it originates from actually modeling the visual system. So the idea here is that in order to bind together two representations, you activate them at the same time. So for example, if you want to encode Bill loves Mary, then the representation of Bill and the representation of lover should be activated at the same time, right here. And the representation of Mary and the representation of beloved are activated at the same time. This is how they are bound. This is how the system knows that Bill is lover and Mary is beloved. If you want to encode Mary loves Bill, then Bill will be activated at the same time as beloved, and Mary will be activated at the same time as lover. This looks nice and simple and good, but there are several problems with it. First of all, such an account predicts that you have distinct representation of roles and relations and viewers. So relational concepts in this view consist of predicate representation, such as loves, the concept of loves in general, and a distinct representation of a lover and a distinct representation of beloved. This is a prediction of this model. Maybe this prediction is correct, although, at least to my knowledge, there is not so much evidence supporting it, but maybe this is correct. But it's certainly a constraint, which is given by this model. Another prediction is that you need time. So these representations unfold in time. If you take a certain moment in this graphic, if you only look at, for example, time 0, t0, you can't actually see what's done to what. You need to observe the operation of the system in time in order to understand what's going on. Which again might be the truth, or maybe not. So there are lots of arguments against the use of temporal binding in the biological brain. So I won't go into all these arguments, but some of them are about, so who is actually observing the system? Who knows what is activated at the same time as other things? Is this a central unit processor? Is this a homunculus in the brain who is actually observing all this? The frame of reference and things like that. There are several papers by van der Velde, if you're interested, you can look, and also papers by Feldman and some others about the problems of temporal binding. So another purely physiological problem is that the existing evidence suggests that the brain doesn't have such good temporal resolution to be able to implement temporal binding. So a lot of neuroscientists are skeptic about. They don't believe that the brain can actually implement temporal binding. So they're both computational and neurophysiological arguments against temporal binding. I have also a pragmatic objection, and my pragmatic objection is that, okay, you can model things in this way using temporal binding, but that limits yourself a lot. Because if you want to use this model with some other models, for example, if you want to take the benefit of integrating some advanced neural network models from different domains, for example, if you want to make use of the recent progress in deep learning, it's virtually impossible because these models are very specific. They require very specific machinery, computationally not efficient at all. So it's kind of impossible to integrate them into some existing connections frameworks. And of course, this is a pure pragmatic objection. So it's not that scientific, but it's a methodological one. Now I'm going to present you my idea about how a binding is implemented in connectionist terms. That's idea I developed together with Jeff Bowers. I'm still working on it. So there's several main assumptions of the vector approach to representing symbols, or the vector account to representing symbols. First of all, we presume there exist redundant representations. So there are different ways to represent the same things, absolutely the same things. And this redundant representation of functional equivalent, meaning that it doesn't really matter which of these representations you're going to use. And as you might guess, we are using this assumption in order to solve the problem of two. So we can represent one thing in one way or another way, and they're both the same thing. Also, we presume that there's separate representation of semantic and binding information. These are two orthogonal representational dimensions. So the representation of semantics is different than the representation of binding. Of course, they're related, but they're different, they're independent, which ensures the raw field independence, and which ensures that our representations don't suffer from the problem of tensor products, because the and similarity of VARS representation is a function of two independent systems, so they don't interact. And of course, just like tensor products, we assume that representation capacity is limited by the number of predicates or the number of things we can represent at a given time, and the maximal arity of the predicates, or in other words, the maximal arguments of relations, the maximal number of arguments of relations, which can be, for example, 2, 3, or 4. By the way, there's another line of work of Graham Halford in which he argues that the limit, the reason, the source of the working memory limit is the maximal arity of the predicates that we can represent, which is not quite related to his tensor products work, but Yes, that's another hypothesis. So this is what VARS representations look like. Well, actually, I'm presenting here a VARS representations in a way which is more easier to understand, but the real VARS representation is just one numeric vector. So although I'm presenting it here in 2 dimensions, you don't really need this. I mean, you can just put it in 1 dimension. It's a vector of fixed size. So whatever we do, we add information, we bind information whatsoever, we only have a fixed dimension. So the vector is a fixed dimension, which is what's needed for connectionist modeling. So on the left, we have the representation of semantics, and on the right, the representation of structural information or the bindings. So the semantics consist of a limited number of slots or kind of boxes in which I can put different kind of information. So these slots are exactly the things which store semantics, such as a pattern of activation describing the dog or a cat, and they're functionally equivalent, meaning that if I represent dog in the first slot or I represent dog in the sixth slot, it doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter where the dog is. The same pattern can appear in any of these slots and means the same thing. For example, if I have 2 dogs, two cats, I can represent them in this way. This is how we solve the problem of 2. So we have 1 cat in slot 1, another cat in slot 4. So we have 2 cats. It is the same pattern here and here. If they're the same cat, absolutely the same cats, it's the same pattern, but as long as it's in different locations, we don't have the problem of 2 anymore. Moreover, these 2 representations are functionally the same. They mean the same thing. So from a functional point of view, for example, if you run behavior experiments and ask people what they see, they say 2 cats, 2 cats. It's all the same. Although the representations are activated at different locations, they mean the same. So this is an assumption. We just, small diversion, we have demonstrated actually that conventional neural networks, like simple neural networks, feedforward and recurrent neural networks, can actually implement this. They can learn that these 2 things are the same and treat them equivalent. So here is how we solve the variable binding problem. So here, for clarity, in these 2 situations, the objects and the relations are activated in the same slots. The difference is in the binding information. So here, this part of the binding information is used to bind the first argument of relations. This part is used to bind, this is used to bind the second argument of relations. That's why I said there is a constraint on the number of arguments you can have on the maximal arity, because you only have a limited number of binding matrices like this. In this case, 2 of them. So you can represent relations with no more than 2 arguments. Of course, you can increase this parameter and have 3 binding matrices in which you will be able to represent relations with up to 3 arguments. Now, this activation here, the activation of this unit, tells us that the first argument, because in the first binding matrix, the first argument of sits on, because it's on the same row as sits on, is located in slot 3, because it's the 3rd neuron in this row here. So by activating this neuron, I know that the first argument of sits on is in slot 3. And by activating this unit, I know that the first argument of sits on is in slot 5. And the same for the second argument. So here the second argument sits on is in there's some, yes, the second argument is in slot 3 because the cat is the one which is seated on, and here the second argument is in slot 5 because the dog is being sit on. So by activating a particular unit in the binding matrices or binding spaces as we call them, we know what's the relationship between information representing particular slots. Now, if the information here is not a relational, it doesn't have arguments, so it has arity 0, then of course you never have any units active on. If you have a relation, then depending on how many arguments it has a certain number of units on the corresponding row being activated. So this is the representational scheme we use to represent any kind of relational and non-relational information, which has the desirable properties. So if you compare two such kind of representations, you can compare separately, independently, the semantics and the structure. I'll show you in a while. So the similarity of these representations will be a function of the semantics and the structure, but they don't interact. So the degree to which the semantics overlap is independent of the degree to which binding overlaps. So we don't have the problem of tensor products. And these representations are static. We don't need time. We don't need temporal binding and so forth. And we can represent high order relations as well. For example, Peter knows that Mary loves John. So knows is a high order, second order relation. The first argument of knows is in slot 5, that's Peter. The second argument of knows is slot 3, which is loves. And the first argument of loves is slot 4, which is Mary. And the second argument of loves is in slot 2, which is John. So this is how we represent high order information, high order relations. Actually, the only limit on the maximal order is the number of slots you have. You have lots of slots, you can actually represent higher, very high orders. So this VARS representation kind of threatens the representations of nested predicates of high order information. And this is even more complex. The fact that Peter knows that Mary loves John causes Peter to be jealous of Mary because of John, something like that. So in order to be able to represent this complex relational structure, you need 7 slots. And because jealous here is a relation with 3 arguments, then we need 3 binding matrices. So we can only represent this if you have 3 binding matrices. Of course, one can argue whether jealous is a 2-argument or 3-argument relation, a binary or ternary relation. Now, the main point is that such representations are not only powerful, they only have representation of, VARS doesn't only have representation of power, so you can represent all kinds of things in a very straightforward way. But you can actually use these representations. And unlike the tensor products approach, you don't need to decompose them in their constituents in order to be able to compare them. Actually, you can just directly compare them using cosine similarity, for example. So the similarity of 2 representations, call them the target and the base, as is the tradition in analogy making literature, is a function of the cosine similarity of the semantics and the cosine similarity of the structure or the binding. So this is the structure here, this part of the vector. So the vector is split into 2 parts. We first compare the semantics part, which has fixed dimensionality, and then we compare the structural part, which also has fixed dimensionality. And of course, we can put different weight on the structure and the semantics, depending on what. Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to let you know that we have a little over 15 minutes to the remaining, so I want to make sure that you have time for questions.
Sure. Okay.
I don't want to rush you though.
Actually, I'm approaching the end. So how does it work? How can you use this formula for comparing 2 situations? For example, let's assume you want to compare John loves Mary. You want to map John loves Mary to Peter loves Emma. Now, you cannot directly compare the 2 vectors because of this random allocation per slots. So in this case, for example, VARS is in the third slot and here VARS is in the first slot. So what we have to do is to rearrange this vector in all possible ways, moving the predicates across the slots. So you need to have the permutation of all slots allocations. You compare each of them with the target one, and you select the one which produces the higher cosine similarity. So this is the cosine similarity here, or any other measure of vector similarity. So I take this vector, I produce all the possible permutations of the slot allocations, and I select the one which maximizes the vector similarity. This is this one. And when I do this, I first see how much the similarity is. That's the cosine similarity of these vectors. And I also see which predicate in the target corresponds to which predicate in the base. So in this case, VARS goes to VARS, of course, but also Mary goes to Emma and John goes to Peter. So the result of this simple operation, it's computationally intensive, but it's actually conceptually simple. And I'll show that even computationally, it's not that heavy because it can be parallelized, and we have done this. So this is actually can be done in parallel, this allocation of all possible, this permutation of all possible slots allocation can be done in parallel. So in a parallel architecture, for example, a parallel computer or the brain, which is massively parallel, this is a really easy operation, really cheap operation. And the result of this is how the parallel algorithm works, but that's technical detail. Let's not focus it. But what's important that computing the similarity, maximizing the similarity between these two representations, not only gives you how similar these representations are, but it also tells you what the alignment is. Which entity in the first representation goes to which entity in the second representation. So this operation computes the similarity and does the analogical mapping in a single operation. So just an example of how this model works. So I have implemented these operations. I have implemented that actually using TensorFlow, so it works on a parallel computer, and I have demonstrated that you can benefit from having parallel architecture. So I have shown that it's actually not computationally demanding as long as you have a parallel computational architecture. And this is a simple example. By the way, this example was suggested by John Hummel once when we met and I presented this this approach. So what we have here is a target and a base, and we want to check whether our approach works. So on the target, we have John, who has an apple, and John loves Mary. And in the base, we have Bill, who has a peach, and Joe, who has a pear, and Bill loves Susan. And now the question is, when you map these two situations, will Joe go to Bill or to Joe? It's not trivial because if you only use has, it can go to Bill or it can go to Joe. They both have the has. They both participate in a has relation. So what we have to do here is to map John to Bill because of the last relation, and then use this in order to map John to Bill here as well. So another way, in order to solve this problem, there should be some systematicity pressure in the system. And the question was, will this systematicity pressure be exhibited in this account? And the question is, yes, it is. So this is, I had just copy pasted the results from the model. And indeed, Bill is mapped to John, and apple is mapped to peach because, you know, John goes to Bill, so apple must go to peach, not to pear. So such an example demonstrates that there is systematicity going on in the model. So it's sensitive to higher order relational structures. So it can integrate relational structures. So it can actually inform the binding of some of the elements can inform the bindings of the other elements. That is the total similarity. Here, the sigma is 0.5, so there's different It's the same weight for structure and for semantics. Now, I have run many examples like this, and basically it works very well. It can do cross-mapping, it can do higher-order integration. I have struggled to find an example in which the model fails, in which it makes some strange mapping. So let me just summarize what I said so far. So this approach to analogical mapping, I think, is very promising. Well, first of all, it can account for systematicity, which is really important. That's the hallmark of the analogy making. So it's sensitive to relational structure and to higher order relational constraints, and it can integrate bindings in different relations. There's a lot of representation of power. It can represent symmetric relations. I didn't say about this, but you can actually bind the argument. If you have a symmetric relation, you can actually use only the first matrix. And in this way, you're not forced to determine which is the first argument, which is the second one. We just don't have time to mention this, but it's an advantage compared to other approaches such as tensor products. And also it supports something which is currently not supported by any other model. So you can map a role to multiple arguments. So for example, the first relation of left of the first role or argument of left of can be mapped to several objects at the same time. So we can say like the cup and the computer are to the left of the desk, for example, which is again not allowed by other approaches. The relations that we use can actually come from mainstream deep learning architectures. We have such simulations showing that you can train a classical neural network without any fancy mechanisms to produce such VARS representations, to learn relations, to learn to bind them to the proper arguments and so forth. Even if you don't use this, you can still use rich semantic representations such as word embeddings. You can just put word embeddings into the slots. And this is what I did for this simulation. For example, for peach, I took the graph embedding of peach and just put it in the corresponding slot. So we can actually make use of these resisting representations, even if you don't learn them. But you can also learn them if you want. As I said, the approach can be subjected to efficient parallel implementation. They exist in such an implementation, and I have implemented it. And last but not least, what I like about this approach is that it gives you a normalized measure of similarity, which is structure sensitive and semantics sensitive, semantically sensitive. It's normalized, meaning that it varies between like -1 and 1 if it's cosine similarity. If you use some other measure, it can vary between 0 and 1. And that's important because that's a huge problem if you do connectionist modeling and any kind of modeling of analogy making. Sometimes you wonder how good my analogy is. So the model found an analogy, but how good it is. And as long as the measure is not normalized, you don't know what's the maximum or the minimum, you can't answer this question. You can only compare situation, but you don't have a universal measure of similarity. And this approach gives you such a measure because it's based on simple measures of vector similarity, which are normalized, such as cosine similarity, for example. So it can produce a normalized measure of analogical similarity as well. Of course, you're not bound to use cosine similarity. I mention it all the time, but any kind of vector similarity measure can be used in this approach. And future directions, what I'm working on now. So I'm trying to add more functions that currently missing. So I have added actually the ability to compare one target to multiple bases and select the best one. I'm working now on episodic memories on the retrieval. So the process in which you retrieve particular bases before you map them to the target. I'm also trying to apply this for text similarity measure to build a new kind of analogical text similarity measure. It's a more applied project. And it's always with modeling analogy making, the huge problem is relations. Where do they come from? And I have done some work on using VARS as the output of deep learning methods, like fancy deep learning methods such as the BERT model, NLP model, and some other fancy models and very efficient models. And putting it all together allows to recognize relations in perceptual input or in text input, and not just derivation, but like higher order derivations, which is a very hard problem if you don't use some flexible relational representation such as VARS. Okay, thank you.